Hey Barry, good morning. How are you?
Good morning, Michael. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. And hello to everybody. Thank you for tuning in and listening. For those of you watching on YouTube, welcome. Thank you. If you would be so kind as to subscribe, leave us a positive review, leave a comment, we would be most appreciative. Anyways, today, Barry, we are talking about Wendy Chung and her book, Updating to Remain the Same. You want to talk a little bit about how and why we got here, maybe?
Well, we got here because we had just finished talking about Michael Miller's excellent essay, Platforms of Control. And Chun is one of the thinkers about internet culture that Miller, makes reference to. More specifically, Miller uses Chun in at various points in his essay to do to make a kind of intellectual move that that I think we found particularly interesting. When Miller tries to bring together, um, he's producing a sort of read of internet culture and how it develops and like the actual practice of internet interaction on the internet, and he's talking about ways in which people construct the self, right? Construct themselves, construct their self image on the internet. And at certain points, he will step away from the internet, so to speak, or from digital life and talk about larger economic systems, particularly the idea of neoliberalism. And whenever he does that, most often he is referencing Wendy Chun, and in particular, this book about updating. And so that's what sparked our interest in trying to go back to the source. I think this is a 2018 book or something like that, maybe a little bit earlier, 2016, 17. But we went back a little bit, so we wanted to catch up with Chun and sort of go to the source of these arguments about neoliberalism and the current state of digital culture. Why, Michael? Can I add one more thing? Why are we
Had
interested in
to,
that?
had to.
Because I think one of the things we've been doing, or we find ourselves doing in these episodes, is trying to draw connections between internet culture and larger political and inevitably economic formations, right?
Mhm.
And so Miller's doing that, and he's using Chun as a guide to doing that. And so that's how we got here. And then when we got here, I could talk about some of the things we found when we got here, but do you want to
Yeah,
comment on that?
I just wanted to add. I think there's an interesting synthesis in Chun in looking at Miller and connections. I think that we're going to make clear probably pretty soon
You're
between.
optimistic on it. You're
I'm
optimistic that we're
feeling
going
good
to make
today.
it clear.
um, well, let me put it this way. I think there are connections to be made. We'll see about the clarity. But what I think is particularly fascinating about this in terms of neoliberalism is that we take Miller's arguments and in many ways Chun marries those and the sort of intellectual capital of or the attention capital of Bernard Stiegler. And I think
Hmm.
that her discussions of neoliberalism um,
Reminded us of Stiegler, right?
very
Some
much so.
Stieglers.
But I think that what was interesting is this provides us a language to quantify or better understand the economic potential of attention. I think,
Oh,
and
which is a
that's
Stiglerian keyword, right?
very
Attention,
much.
retention,
Yeah,
memory.
and it's not without its problems. But there's an interest. I think that Chun is an interesting um, sort of bridge between a lot of the stuff that we have been talking
That's a
about
great point.
and where Miller put us. So if you want to jump into her terms, we could. It's probably
Yeah,
as good a jumping off point as any.
I will, but let me just say that I really like your point because I think that explained why we kind of went. I think we kind of immediately agreed um, why we were immediately predisposed and why we had a positive reaction to Chun when we started reading the book
Mhm.
because in a way she introduces. I want to say one other thing about this, but I wanted to strongly agree. with your claim that I think the reason we were interested in her, so interested in what she was doing, is that we recognize that she is using some of the same terms, psychological terms maybe, or cognitive terms that we recognize and we became familiar with in reading Stiegler, affect, but primarily, as you say, attention, retention, habit, the
Yeah.
non-reflective, reflective, non-reflective, noesis, all these sort of terms about cognition in the digital age. So that's one of the reasons we were attracted to it. But before we talk about her terminology, and you're right, um, habit crisis update, her keywords,
Her
there
math
is a
problem.
resonance, huh?
Her math problem.
Her math problem. Yeah. Uh, it relates a lot to Stiegler. But I think I wanted to say at the very beginning that she doesn't invoke, I think it's worth saying, she doesn't invoke Stiegler, right? I didn't notice any place where she doesn't reference him.
The
And
no.
I want to say, I do think that there is a fundamental difference between, even though she's using these terms that recall Stiegler. I'm going to go on the record here. Maybe Michael, you don't feel this strongly, but I think there's a big difference between Chun and Stiegler. So
I think that so for me, her use of the word pharmacon one time in the introduction was all
that's all you
that's all I
need.
need.
And we were off and running.
I think that's
But
give me
but
the
did you
bag.
notice in that passage, as soon as she uses it, she argues that. So maybe habit is a pharmacon. Not to get too far ahead, but just to say, she says maybe habit is a pharmacon. And we got our Stieglerian impulse,
Well,
our Stiegler antenna went up.
and
And then she
here's
says, perhaps.
perhaps that's exactly what I was going to say. She has a one word sentence following pharmacon, perhaps. And so I think that, but I think that's that little space that you and I are going to insinuate ourselves into and just say, here we go. Because the space is there. And I think that that's what makes texts like this particularly interesting and fun, if I may say, is the ability to make these connections that maybe aren't entirely intended, but I think the overlap is unquestionably there.
Okay,
So
so
let's
are
talk
yeah,
about.
let's get into the terms. Now, before we get, let me identify the terms, and
Mhm.
we're gonna sort of work them through. Habit, the three keywords, her by her, this is what she states are her keywords. Habit, crisis, update. Again, to reiterate, um, in all of these terms, I think there is a way in which Chun believes the terms are very relevant for the description of contemporary digital culture. But behind it, this is part of her project. Behind these terms, there's not just a sort of ways in which it describes internet practice, but there's an implied economic political self that is being worked out or being produced or somehow being activated, and that these particular terms give her purchase on. So it's the marrying of neoliberalism and digital culture that she's trying to describe when she uses these three
Mhm.
terms.
Mhm.
So in order to preface our discussion, I'm just going to read this very short bit from Chun, because I think this is kind of the foundation.
Okay.
It's what allows her, this is foundational idea that allows her to to intertwine neoliberalism and digital practice. Okay, here it is. Habit plus crisis equals update also makes clear, her book also makes clear the ways in which networks do not produce a we. She's referencing Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities idea, um, but rather produces a relentlessly pointed yet empty, singular yet plural you. I'm going to skip down just a little bit and read a little bit more. New media are new media. Okay, I can't do this, but she spells new as in parentheses you media, meaning, as she defines it in the next phrase, new media are a function of you. New media relentlessly emphasize you. It's a construction of you, and we're going to talk about that in a second. YouTube What's on your mind? You are the person of the year. And she's referencing an article in Time where you, and you is the visual representation of you on the cover of Time, is a picture of your personal computer,
Mhm.
which is you, YOU. Okay, so I think if we explain, Michael, why you, what you means for Chun, I think that's a necessary prelude to explaining habit crisis update. I think everything gets out of it. Do you want me to? Do you want? I can
Yeah,
start.
yeah.
Well, here's the first thing I think she's saying when she says, "Okay, new media is all about you." Okay, the first thing about this "you" is that the first thing to say about it is the "you" is no longer a personal identity, um, totally free of, or totally, that's totally absent or escapes the public sphere. The "you" is at one and the same time it's a confusion of categories.
Well,
That is what's happening in neoliberalism, and that's what's being reflected in internet culture. Is that okay? I started.
it is, and
That's
I think that's a great entryway, because I think what we're, again, in order to understand you, we have to contextualize this, and she's talking about this in the context of new media, and one of the real, I don't want to call, what do we call this? One of the conundrums, the problems to manage or navigate here, is the notion or the role of the network. And
right.
as Stiegler makes clear, but this is Chun's very much wrestling with as well. Um, the the conception of you in a media context is always a networked conception, and I think that in that
Right.
network,
Right.
what happens is we lose the individual,
That's a great point.
and that I think is what she's playing with here, is that um, a relentlessly pointed, empty, singular, yet plural you,
Yeah,
right? Like
plural. A
the
network. A
right. So
network.
yes, and so you in this case exists in conjunction with me, but it also exists in conjunction with the person listening to this or watching
Right.
this. So the idea of a singularity is plural. It sounds so weird to say, but like the singular has become pluralized, and
But
so
you got me, but that's key, what you just said, and you said it's weird to say, but that is exactly what she's trying to describe, that
mhm,
confusion, that
mhm.
weirdness, that the you, I mean, you said also like that you implied that she's saying that the individual is now lost. It's not quite that, or the personal is now lost. um it's not quite that though, right? It's that the personal and the individual is still there, but it's part of the conglomerate that you're speaking of,
Well, and
right?
this, I think this is sort of the one of the overarching points that we're dealing with here, right? This, I mean, so look at the title, "Updating to Remain the Same," right?
You hit it.
This
Yeah.
this is a this is how we are updated. Okay. And so I think that the notion of you, or the comfort and the familiarity of a single me or you, right, is challenged in a networked context. And for Chun,
Correct. Right. Great way to
e-
put it.
everything is networked. And so I think maybe this is a good time to look at her terms and sort of
Yes.
tease them out.
Okay.
Un,
Do you
un,
want to
un,
do you want to try habit?
yeah,
You want to go
absolutely.
for a habit? Yeah.
Yeah. So the idea here, so her three terms, again, as an equation, are habit plus crisis equals update. Okay. And again, I think it's really important to emphasize that all of this is in a networked context, right? So she she sort of spins habit in a way that I'm not entirely comfortable with, because
Well, let's just say at the outset, it's the master concept in what we're talking. We're mostly talking about the, I guess it's the first chapter, right? Which is kind of the big
mhm,
introduction.
mhm,
Um, I think it's the master concept of the chapter, and she gives a lot of intellectual backstory about, especially about what 19th century and early 20th century philosophers and social critics, how they defined or redefined habit.
mhm.
But it's very I was just about to say that, I was just going to add that it's very complex. It's like very, I mean, if one of the reasons I think you're saying you struggle, I struggle too. I think any reader is going to struggle because it's a very nuanced and very in-depth sort of definition and redeployment of that term.
Hmm.
But
So the term. the language that she came up with that I glommed onto, and again, I as I read it, there are a couple different um, there's a couple different understandings of this, but she calls habit the creative anticipations based on past repetition,
Mhm.
right? And that's not totally at odds with, I think, probably a fairly common understanding of habit. This idea of repetition that harkens back to the past. But what sort of threw me about
Mhm.
this
Mhm.
was the inclusion of the word creative,
Mhm.
because she goes on to say that addictions are habits, and that habit is not a conscious, um, mindful practice
Right.
so much as it is repetition.
Right. Right.
And
An unconscious practice by
yes, yeah, and
definition.
so
Right.
it becomes, to my mind at first, this seemed a very contradictory
Mhm.
way of engaging the term.
Mhm.
But again, I think that if you look at it in the context of both the equation and the network, there's a way through. How before we push onwards to the rest of the equation and the terms, what are you doing with habit? How's that sitting for
Well,
you?
I'm going to um, answer that question with a slight deflection, but
Dodge away.
I, no, but a very friendly deflection, and it's not just that I'm not going to directly answer it. I want to return to something you said that I think is would be helpful for everyone if we maybe linger, especially for those who haven't read this yet, right?
Mhm.
Let's sort of spell out a step. Let's take this as an opportunity to spell out a step that's kind of assumed in her writing, and let's linger on it and see whether or not you and I may not agree with her on this,
Mhm.
but for a lot of reasons I think we should just try to spell it out. You mentioned, and this is true to my reading of the text as well, then when she talks about, she gives a backstory of habit and how philosophers have thought about habit and how they defined it as this curiously productive. And this is where she uses the pharmacon idea.
Mhm.
It's at one and the same time, habit is kind of soul destroying. And at the same time, it's kind of curative and creative and generative. That seems to have been the spin that specifically 20th century thinkers have come across,
Mhm.
when they use this concept, including Deleuze, I believe she mentioned, was thinking of habit as potentially being a fallow ground for creativity. But very important to her argument is that in the digital world, habit is now addiction. I think we owe it to our readers, listeners, viewers to explain why the hell that would be. Does that make sense? Or why would she say that habit is now in a way that it wasn't before? Or at least that's the implication that I see. That when it comes to digital culture, habit has the modality, a new modality, and the new modality is what uh, addiction.
Mhm.
It's a
Well,
narcotic, which I don't think it had that valence before. And she says she kind of takes it for granted that it does on the internet. Why would that be?
so again, I think it's important that you add that last bit, that this is through our machines. This is on the internet. This is habit in a network state, right? So she says, through habits, users become their machines. They
Mhm.
stream, update, capture, upload, share, grind, link, verify, map, save, trash, and troll. Repetition breeds expertise, even as it breeds boredom, right? That these habits are grooved in to the ways in which we engage with the internet and the ways
Right,
in which we
right,
establish
right.
and orient ourselves within networks. Okay. So the idea that this would be habitual, would be addictive in a sense, right? Is that, again, I think it's important to Chun, everything is networked, right? So there isn't really a place to exist outside of this.
Mhm,
And these are our means of engagement, and they are largely dictated and determined
mhm,
by the by the action itself. Okay. So I don't know that you have a means of removing yourself from extricating from the network in these ways. And I don't know. I guess maybe we need to spend a little bit of time thinking about what it is to be addicted in Chun's sense. But
Mm-hmm.
I
Yeah.
think that the habits that
Mm-hmm.
become the behaviors that become habitual are grooved in such a way that they become sort of self-determining. And I think that the nature of the network creates a scenario where extrication is not entirely possible, even in this context. And so I think that the addictive nature,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you think about it, my understanding of addiction in this context is is a scenario where you cannot consciously or unconsciously really very easily remove yourself. You are
Right.
in a forced pattern, if you will.
Right. Right.
And so my take on this is that that forced pattern is the nature of context and use.
And that's addiction. And that is really part of what she means. This forced pattern that we are unconscious of, it's habited as addiction,
But
right?
I don't. I
That's oh,
does
you
so.
don't like
Well,
that?
no. I have a question for you about that. I don't even know if consciousness matters. I mean, so to take this way out of context, then maybe we can bring it back.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if I want a
Mm-hmm.
piece of toast, I'm going to go put a piece of bread in the toaster and I'm going to start it. I can be conscious or unconscious of it. It doesn't matter if that is my means of making toast. That's what I'm going to do. And so I think that this, in a way, this flies counter
Mm-hmm.
to a lot of the sort of idealistic take on technology and the hacking cultures and the ability to sort of bend
The
programming.
internet to our aims, right? Like
Yeah,
we're
yeah,
going to bend the technology so it reflects our
yeah.
anarchist
I
ideals,
think, I
right?
mean, this
Yeah.
flies directly in the
Yeah.
use. Maybe I'm
Yeah.
misguided in this term, but like of hacker culture. Um, but at the same time, I think that if you take and temporality becomes an interesting question here, but I think if you take a long view of this, I think Chum would say that's fine. You know,
Hmm.
give it a minute, and it will become the new pattern, and you are now habituated into that.
So, Michael, that's wonderful. Do we have a quick way of saying why habits and addiction? So, what about that process? I don't know if we answered that basic
Well,
question, or did we? Did we?
I think so. I'll try it again. Again, I don't know how clear this is, but um, I think that habituation or habit becomes addiction
Mhm.
because our options in habit are limited. We cannot easily change or remove ourselves
I
from
see what
these
you're saying.
processes. That's my take. Um,
Okay.
and so,
Okay, I like that. I like that. Let me
yeah.
add something to it.
Mhm.
Let me add something to it, and maybe we should move on to talk about how crisis and update fit into this. But
Sure.
just add something to this because this is, we opened up by saying that what Chun is trying to do is bring together kind of she's using these terms in order to both clarify the political formation and economic formation we live in, and also to illuminate what we do on the net, like you were describing.
Mhm.
And so there's an interesting passage on page 8 in my in my runoff, or my purloined copy or free copy, and our anarchistic free copy, where she says that habits. Okay, I here's the statement. Why is habit resurging in the era of neoliberalism, in which we are all individuals, in which, as Margaret Thatcher declared, there's no such thing anymore as society? Our habits, Chun asks, our habits would endure a society within collectives in which there is no society. Now, that to me is part of this equation. I wanted to bring that up for this very simple reason. We're talking about, and you gave a really excellent sort of overview of how habit works out in internet practice, right? Through this sort of unconscious, unreflective practice, right? But I read that sentence to say something additional but important. She's saying that neoliberalism, because there aren't these structures on the outside of the internet or anywhere, we're kind of habituated, if I can use a term, we're kind of inclined or even habituated to become habitual, to be habitual creatures in whatever we do, including the internet culture. That's how I'm kind of reading this. Like, if there wasn't an internet, neoliberalism would have to invent one. It's not quite that, but I
No,
am
but
saying
you know what?
that independent of the internet, there is something that is making us habitual creatures at this particular moment.
Well, I think that's right. And I think that, I don't know when Margaret Thatcher said this, but it's entirely
Early
likely that it
80s,
was in a
early 80s,
pre
like the
that
Reagan era.
it was a pre-internet state.
Yeah.
Remember that the internet here is simply the networked condition that we find ourselves in. So I think that there is a non-digital version of this that still holds. For
Mhm.
me, it's easier to talk about the neoliberalist implications after we unpack Chun's equation,
Agreed.
because I think that what what Chun's done, we've got crisis or habit plus crisis equals update. I think that in order to understand what that is, you have to understand the entirety of the equation first. So if we've talked about
Please do.
if
Please do.
we've talked about habit,
Mhm.
crisis, I think, is an interesting term. Uh,
Mhm.
to me, crisis is a direct nod to our networked condition.
Mhm.
And so, do you want to take a crack at this, or do you want me to?
I thought you were going to take us all the way through, but I'll do something,
It's
Jerry.
gonna
You
be it's
seem
gonna
like
be
you're on a roll.
yeah, it's gonna be bumper cars if I do. Why don't
Let's
like
do, whatever you want, whatever
go
you
ahead, go
want.
ahead, go ahead, go ahead.
Well, let me just start something, and then you will finish it much better than I would. But I think we are at the point where we should try to put the formula together now. We've
Mhm.
talked enough about habit, and God help us, we did the best we could. But now let's see if we can put all the elements in a row before we wrap this up. So habit, it's this internet thing, but it's also this extra internet thing, metacultural thing, right? This
Mhm,
bigger
mhm.
cultural process. Okay. How does it lead to crisis and update in internet culture? Well, again, crisis, there's obviously an economic, political modality of crisis. We are effing living in it, right? And have been for a long time. How does this manifest in internet culture? Now, I think this is how it works out. Um, as habituated creatures everywhere, but also on the internet, we are inclined to look at technological, maybe in a way, this hooks up to a discussion that we were having a few weeks ago about technofatalism.
Mhm.
Because I think we are habituated, I think Chun is saying we're habituated to internalize the instant obsolescence of technology. And so that the price of having an internet is that we internalize and habitually internalize constant updating, constant changes, constant changes that happen on the internet. We don't think, oh my goodness, Netflix has updated its policies. I'm getting off the internet now. I'm out of here. I'm out of here. No, we should say, oh yeah, let me just push a button here. Let me push a button here. And so I can keep on playing the game.
So let me ask you a question.
Yeah. No, well, first off, do you agree with that? I mean, is
I
that kind of like,
I think so. I think so. Let me ask you a question. So if we're trying to tease out what crisis is,
yeah,
right? Um, Rather than saying, "Oh my God, Netflix has changed something," let's take a different look at this.
yeah.
What does a state of non-crisis look like? Right? Because to
We have
me,
no idea. I
no,
think
but I
that would
but
be
I
a
but I,
thing.
but
We
I
have no
think
idea.
no, I think we have an idea, and I think the reason that we have an idea
Mhm.
is why we can have crisis in the first place. Okay. I think that this idea of non crisis is this ideal that enables us to process crisis, right? So, this idea of non crisis is essentially consistency, right? Non crisis is a world where I wake up and everything is exactly where I left it. Okay. And that's it.
I
They have
long for that world.
they
I
haven't
long for that world.
nobody has rearranged the page. Nobody has moved something, right? Non-crisis is everything exactly where it is supposed to be in my world.
Right.
And so non-crisis in a nutshell is consistent. Okay. And so then if we take that as our starting point,
Mm-hmm.
crisis then is an aberration. It is an
Mm-hmm.
inconsistency. It is a change. And in networks, one thing we know is that there is always going to be a measure of instability. There will always be a measure of
Right.
crisis,
Right.
right? Now,
Right.
again, I'm approaching
Right.
this. Sit down, brace yourself, right? This is the new materialist to me, that looks as networks as the roll your eyes as these.
To that a bit more. Anyway,
Do you need a
this
moment to
is
think?
this is our shtick, ladies and gentlemen.
So,
So you
so
know,
if we look at this, from a new materialist perspective, right, where
right,
the network is
right,
always shifting.
right, right,
So
right, right,
we exist in a situation where there is
right.
enough familiarity to be, but the crisis is that our role in a particular network is constantly changing. And as we make sense
That's
of our
wonderful.
as we
Yeah.
make sense of ourselves in relation to the things around us, it's very difficult to have a stable, comfortable, non-crisis version, which is why you can get really upset about Netflix changing because you have this desire to have it remain where it was yesterday, right? So if we look at now habit next to crisis, right? Habit are these grooved, repeated, sometimes nearly forced behaviors. But the problem is those are only comfortable in a consistent environment, right? So if you keep shifting the lanes a little bit, I'm never going to be able to be completely comfortable. I can function, right? Because nobody has deleted Netflix. There's still enough of whatever, whatever determines the network to be recognizable. And I can still
Mm-hmm.
understand my
Mm-hmm.
position. I'm just not comfortable with my position. So if we have,
Mm-hmm.
uh, you know,
YouTube, your model, by the way, is even more clear, like with YouTube, right, where things get pulled all the time.
yeah,
But so
absolutely.
there's an inconsistency, but then we live with the inconsistency. We live with the update, right?
Yeah, we live with familiarity, not
Right, right. It's
so,
a
so
dialectic of the two,
right,
familiarity and the update. Yeah.
right. So her habit plus crisis equals update. I understand this to say, look, we are forced into and become comfortable or
Right.
functionally uncomfortable
With update.
with certain
I'm sorry.
behavior. No, with
Yeah.
certain behaviors.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. And those behaviors work really well or really consistently in a stable network. The problem is A, everything is networked, and B, nothing is inherently fully stable. There are measures of stability, right? But this is always going to be the ground is always going to move under your feet somewhat. So, what happens when you put those two together? Update, right? And those
Right.
habits and those addictions shift perhaps to accommodate the new scenario, the new network reality. And while that creates a moment of stability,
Mm-hmm.
the constant here is crisis. And that crisis is crisis because it challenged our habits. And in doing so, we update again, which is why I think, updating to remain the same in order to remain consistent, in order to remain stable, we have to be in some measure unstable or dynamic.
Dr. Peachy is on a roll. He brought it all together. Habit plus crisis update. Can I just add two really quick things? And then I think we should,
Although
I
I
think we
think
should, oh, go ahead. I'm
I was
sorry.
going to say, I think before we go
Oh,
too
before we
too
do.
crazy, I
Mhm.
think we need to now attach neoliberalism to this.
Well, let me do that.
Yeah, yeah.
That's what I was about to do.
Okay.
The because I think you did a wonderful. Um, I think see if I can do this. What I was thinking of when you were just doing your little phenomenology of the internet, I was thinking, making a comparison of internet behaviors. I was trying to think about, I was trying to think about the two kinds of instability that Chun delineates. And I think this is kind of how it works out. Tell me if you agree. Forget the internet for a moment. Just think about market society.
Mhm.
How does our economies work? We have to get used to capitalism. We have to live with instability. Why do we have to live with instability? Because that's the way markets work.
Mhm.
Markets were not developed by cats that want to have everything in place when they wake up in the morning. Don't you know this about you? Do
I'm
you
not
live
a
with cats?
in
Yeah,
fact,
cats hate it when you move things and they're out of place. I empathize with cats. That's why I'm a cat person.
okay. I
But
got a dog,
the
so
world, yeah, that's it. You're a different phenomenology. But anyway, your your description of a world of homeostasis
mhm.
where, like, it's comfortable and it's consistent. Uh, market capitalism ain't that. That's the opposite of it. So what do you have to do to get used to a capitalist society? You got to accommodate to how it works. How does it work? Not by constant consistency, but by constant crisis.
Mhm.
You got to learn how to manage crisis. And crisis in capitalism is viewed by the people who profit from it as like productive change. I just changed something and it's productive, and I profited from it. I know how to manage it. But however you look at that change, whether you think it's disastrous or proof of the inherent virtues of the system, you have to live with the constant crisis. And what you just described, so that's market economy.
Mhm.
So, and what Chun is saying is that when you look at internet culture, and this is hooks up directly with what you just described, there's a parallel thing. The constant situation of technological advance or technological being is that we have to deal with instability. How do we do that? We have to deal with crisis. How do we manage the crisis? Through the update. So that is, I think, how she brings together neoliberalism
Yeah.
and yeah. Is that
Yeah.
making sense, or
It,
what do you think?
no, it makes perfect sense. I mean, I think that what so there's a section in here where
Mm-hmm.
I think if we use her words, this is probably as clean a way through this and out as we're going to find, right? She says, um, neoliberalism, as David Harvey succinctly explains, is, quote, a theory of political economic practices that proposes that human well-being can best be advanced by liberating individual entrepreneurial freedoms and skills within an institutional framework characterized by strong
Right,
private
right,
property rights, free
right.
markets, and trade. She continues, in a neoliberal society, the logic of the market has become its ethics. All human interactions from love to education become economic transactions to be analyzed in terms of costs and balance. And this is where this
Mm-hmm.
comes full circle. As Margaret Thatcher put it, neoliberalism, quote, changes the soul by becoming, Michel Foucault argues, the grid of intelligibility for everything, right? So,
Including the internet.
exactly. But what happens is this is how we make sense of the instability. This is how the update functions, right? It gives us a sense of order in an unordered um, context. I think that we have a target, we move towards the target. And I think that if it's sort of like being seasick, where you have to watch the horizon, right? Everything's moving underneath you. The problem with
Yeah,
this, though,
that's interesting. That's a great analogy. I
okay,
like that.
but the problem with this is that what's happened is that we be again because of the network nature and the pervasiveness of internet culture, right? These I guess the private has been totally subsumed by the public.
Yeah,
That's where I get off.
yeah, yeah. Um, I think we're ready to transition to the end here. We're hopeful guys,
Let's do it.
and I think we wanted to end. We want to end with examining. We mentioned we invoked Stiegler, patron saint Stiegler, at the beginning of the episode.
Mhm.
And we wanted to talk about some confluences, maybe possible tensions between Stiegler's vision of a hopeful digital future and Chun's vision of a hopeful digital future.
Right.
So I think we're ready to deal with that, and we're hopeful guys. We want to examine possibilities of hope. Do we not?
I don't know.
Sort of. Maybe we do.
I don't know.
Just bear with me and go along with for a second. So let's use that as a transition to our final moment to try to bring everything together. Before I do that, though, let me quickly digress. I'm going to read a passage on her page 4 from page 4 of her introduction, and I'm looking again at something I referenced, an illustration in her book. Is it the first illustration? In fact, she reproduces a Time magazine cover where you are the person of the year, right? Michael, did you read the headline, the rest of that cover page? Because it's really fascinating. It's so Time has a picture. Can I show? Can I do this? I
Yeah.
guess I could. Uh,
You,
I just want to give you the quick schema of it.
yes, you control the information age. Welcome to
Welcome
your
to your
world.
world. I mean, now to us, we're looking at this and we think, well, like how many lies are in this image, right? Yes, you. I mean, what blandly, let's call it, I don't say lies, but look how blandly affirmative that issue is. You control the information age. Really? In what way, in the last couple of years, in what ways can you be said to you, individual, personal, or even collective you? Do we feel that we are in control of our PC and
Well,
that welcome to your world? Do you feel you constructed this world that you
so
interact with?
so this is a really fascinating question. And I think that the answer to this question and the answer to the questions I suspect you're probably going to ask in the next couple minutes are very heavily determined by context and by um, the vision you have. Okay.
Mm,
So I think
mm.
if we look at this, you control
That's
the
such a
information age.
reflective answer.
Well,
Such a reflective answer.
think about it, especially in our time. I don't know how well this answer is going to age. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
it depends on how you understand things. If you are of a particular political perspective,
Mm-hmm.
the welcome to you control the information age, welcome to your world. You live in a world of resistance where you are fighting the misinformation of the media, you are fighting
Mm-hmm.
the lies of government, you are responding to to the bait of neoliberalism. And there is absolutely a sense of agency within this. I think on the flip side of that coin, if you are of a certain political perspective that bemoans the death of reason and critical thinking, and
Mm-hmm.
feels that the world is populated by a bunch of people who have been duped and tricked.
Mm-hmm.
Welcome to your world is sarcastic, is cynical, and
Mm-hmm.
the information age has spun so far out of control
Mm-hmm.
that you are now sitting alone in your sailboat, uh, and there's nothing left. So I think that this is an interesting. I think if I'm looking at this, it looks like the date is 2006 or 2004. I think that's a fascinating.
Oh, that's interesting. I thought it was much more recent than that. I mean, recent to the time of her writing than that. I didn't realize that.
No,
That's
no, and I
fascinating.
think so. I think that the answer to this, I mean, I hate to say it depends because that's such a cop out, but I think that this is a really polarizing question, and
It is a polarizing question. No,
which
I agree with
side of
that.
the coin you end up on really depends, I think, on the trust you do or do not have in the institutions that disseminate the information. How do
You
you how do you see it though? I mean, I don't want
Oh,
to.
I don't want to answer. I want to let what you said stand, and maybe we'll return. I mean, you raised so many important questions here. I'm just thinking about the patience and tolerance of our listeners, auditors, viewers. I kind of want to bring this. I kind of want to bring this to a close because we have a reveal at the end, right? We wanted to get to this thing about Stiegler, but I do. I'm not dismissing what you bring up, Michael, because I think I hope let's make a note to ourselves to return to these issues. I'm sure we will very naturally
Mm-hmm.
in a future episode, but I'm not going to directly answer that. But I think we're going to both partly address this when I wanted to read one other bit from that page as a segue to get to Stiegler
Sure, sure,
and to
sure.
try to wrap these things up. But I'm, again, not deflecting it because I think you're very right. I'll say one last thing about it. I felt personally indicted here. I don't know why I do this thing with you, because when you started describing the latter personality, I took it as a personal affront. I'm sure you meant it that way. This is probably our last episode. Ladies and gentlemen, and everyone, this has been a fun venture, but we're probably at the close. But let's bring it to a close in a cordial way, Michael. Anyway,
Let's try.
let's segue to the Stieglerian punchline. If we
It's not going to get better.
It's not going to get better. So let's just end this thing. Anyway, okay, here's where I wanted to go. I was talking about hope, right? We were going to engage her moment of hope. Recall Bernard Stiegler's description or hope or recipe of hope, and then kind of, end with that. So let's do it. Yeah.
Right. So the question, let me see how well I anticipate your thinking here.
Good luck on that.
To me, the overlap that enables us to ask a question where we have Chun on one side and Stiegler on the other is really around, I think, Stiegler's notion of noesis, or sort of creativity, and where how that exists.
And that makes it possible to imagine a brighter future rather than doom and a technological apocalypse. Right.
So I am going to go ahead and take a guess that you're saying that Chun has a darker view of this through the Stiglerian lens. How do you?
Well, let me read her here, and then maybe if I can go first if you want, but I bet you want to go first.
No. I think I'm going to rain on some parades today. I'm feeling.
You are okay. Well, let me read the passage here, and then we'll see where we are on this. Obviously, this was not scripted, ladies and gentlemen. So let's just continue. Okay. Further, Chun writes, habit plus crisis equals update reveals the extent to which habit is no longer habit. Constantly disturbed. Crisis, right? That's what we're talking about. Crisis. The expectation of a constant update. Constantly disturbed. Habit has become addiction. Habit has moved from habes, to have, to addiction, to lose, to be forfeited to one's creditor. Okay, that's the dilemma of internet culture, the dilemma of neoliberalism that Chun is trying to delineate, but she ends this with her assertion of hope. It's a kind of cloudy statement, or ambiguous statement for me, or obscure statement for me, but maybe not for you, maybe not for other readers, but I'll continue. Habit is now a form of dependency, a condition of debt. As the book's conclusion asserts, to be indebted is not necessarily bad. So that mode of interaction, psychology, cognition in the internet, she says, it's not necessarily bad. It's not the end of the world. It's not apocalypse. But indebtedness, this I take to be her future gesture toward a productive future. But indebtedness must be complemented by a politics of forgiving. I just got the pun there, right? Forgiving, but it's also
that's
forgiving.
Good. I got it.
Of giving in excess, but also in advance. F-O-R-E, giving. Okay, so that's her gesture of hope. Do you want to take a gloss? Let me just do what I think she means here, and I bet you can take it from here. What I think she's pointing toward here is this: what she will be counseling. Now, we haven't read and maybe we will do this in a future episode. We'll take a look at her conclusion. We might, but we should say that we haven't read her conclusion, but reading the introduction and the statement of it, we sense some lineaments of her answer. So number one, I think we're right to sense some lineaments of the answer. That Chun, like Stiegler, is not saying turn off your computer, become the Unabomber. That there is a possible positive future that can be had through the internet, through digital culture, but not by shutting it down, right? I mean, she's not a technophobe.
Hmm.
So there is a positive way of engaging. Now, Stiegler, it's complicated. I'm sure you're going to address this. Stiegler is a little bit more ambiguous, I think, and we can talk about this about the in, about the nature of that engagement. He seems to put some checks and curves on the nature of that engagement, of the working through to get to the positive place. Now, with Chun, it seems on the evidence of the introduction, it seems that she is much less ambivalent than Stiegler. I guess this is what I wanted to talk about in terms of the takeaway. She seems to be much less ambivalent about the possibility of staying online 24/7 and still making internet culture work. It seems in the couple of places where she addresses this, not only is she not saying you need to log off and have some, you cultivate your inner noesis, or think about habit. I don't want to anticipate the other argument. I'm just trying to describe what Chun is doing. She seems to be saying that there's some kind of noesis that can be had by staying online, engaging in the internet practices that we already are habituated to. So it seems like the future that Chun wants is something that doesn't, it entails a kind of, well, I don't know. I mean, I guess I'm wondering what is the reflective element of this? It seems like if we keep on doing it and engaging it, we're going to get through it and it's going to become more positive. I think Stiegler has some, uh, resembles her in the positivity, but puts a lot more checks on the process of working through. Okay, I'll stop right there. See what you think.
Um, so I don't see it the same way.
Okay,
And
let's do it.
I my and but again, I want to say clearly that the different read that I have is because I'm reading a lot more. I read habit and the
Mm-hmm.
addictive nature of habit as being
Mm-hmm.
much more central to this than it sounds like you do.
Okay.
So for me, Chun's like the idea of noesis as Stiegler uses it, right? Like this creative thought.
Which is, let's add one thing to that, creative thought, but the ground of the creativity is sometimes in not thinking, not
Right,
in
right,
being
right. But
engaged,
that
right?
that
Non
concept
reflection
that concept is anathema to Chun. I don't even
of which one? Non reflection or noesis or what?
noesis is not that is a different world, and there's a couple reasons. One, Chun is always networked. So there is no singular you. There's always a plural you. So the idea of daydreaming, that can't really be a collaborative act. That can't be a networked act. That has to be an individual act, right? So I think that if you look through what she's saying, I read, so she says habit is a form of dependency, a condition of debt, right? And she says, hey, that's not bad. Well, of course that's not bad because debt is going to bring stability to a network, right? The more I can rely on you, the more I am indebted to you, right? The
Mm-hmm.
less my network is likely to
Mm-hmm.
shift, right? As your world shifts, I'm still, I think I'm more stable in that network.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the question about all this, really, the distinction between Stiegler and Chun is a question of the space between the public and the private, right? For Stiegler, we get to noesis through daydreaming. It's an escape, it's an unplugging. For Chun, that's not possible,
Possible.
right?
And hasn't
You're
been possible maybe for a while,
right.
right?
You are habituated into these
Right,
digital
right,
networks.
right.
And so I think that what she's looking at is the ability to constantly reconfigure yourself, to update yourself so that you can exist within a network. But I don't think that she's allowing for the same sort of spaces that Stiegler would require. Now, again, I'm not going to sit here and say I think that's a horrible thing so much as I'm going to sit here and say I think it's a very different thing, right? And the space between them really, I think, is the ability to step away. Um, I don't know that. I think the neoliberal
Neoliberalistic,
stick. That's a lot of
liberalistic,
sorry. I think
neoliberal.
that the
Yeah,
notion of neoliberalism in Chun
yeah.
is not something that Stiegler is so concerned with, because for Stiegler, we're looking at the always on and the impulse to consume, right? But he's still looking at it. My read is he's still looking at it from a you that can be singular.
I think I don't know if I agree with the first part of that. I think Stiegler has internalized a lot of Marxism.
Mm-hmm.
So I wouldn't say that one is internalized a Marxist critique of neoliberalism and the other person hasn't. I don't know if I would go that far, but I think I strongly agree with you that there is. How did you just say it? Remind me, repeat what you just said if you could, because I thought it was perfect
Well, there's no
about what Stiegler, that there is a possibility of a reflective self. Is that the word you
a
used?
singular self,
Singular self. Yes.
right? And so
Yes.
to me, I
Yes.
think,
Yes.
so here,
Absolutely.
so we like to sort of wrap this up with a takeaway. I think it's probably I
Yeah.
think we fumbled with this enough, perhaps, right? So for me, I'll say this: my takeaway from this in terms of hopefulness, right? I
Mhm.
think that the place of hope is connected to how comfortable we are with the notion of a public private, right? This idea that the
Public
individual,
private split, that, or a private public private, what
I don't know.
exactly?
I think it depends on how. Let me try it this way. I think that the degree to which you can be hopeful is going to be
Depending
related
on whether you believe in a
to
private self,
to how comfortable you can be with a plural self, right?
plural self. Thank you. That's wonderful. Yeah.
How about this? With a visible private or with a shared private.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think if you are comfortable with that, then yeah, there's hope, right? But I think that if you cling to this idea of a singular private, of the opportunity to indulge or engage in Stiegler's notion of singular daydreaming, or of creativity, of downtime, of disconnected experience, then I don't think there's a whole lot of hope. So there's my takeaway.
How about I agree with your takeaway, and then we'll say
That
we'll
means
say
another
goodbye to
episode,
our
Barry.
friends.
That means another episode. Um, I think that works. I talk too much for this one, so I think
You
that's it.
stop that. We're not humble anymore.
So
We're not humble on YouTube. We're on
all right,
YouTube. We
well,
can't be humble anymore.
I'm gonna
We
stop.
can fumble on YouTube,
There you go.
but we can't humble. We
Well,
can't be
listen,
humble.
Barry. Again, as always, this was fun. I enjoyed it. You can laugh at it. For those listening and watching, if you would leave us a review, if you would leave us your comments, if you would leave us your thoughts, um,
And
you know,
tell us, and also if you have ideas about how to go forward.
yeah, is there hope?
Is there
Is
hope?
there hope?
And also if there are ideas for other things you would like to hear us talk about or explore or contribute, touch on, if
All
there's
right.
that.
Well, Barry,
But let me say this though at the very end. I felt like we were inconclusive in this episode, but I hope that viewers, listeners, um, can get something from our attempt to sort of work with material. And I just wanted to give a shout out to my co-host. I always feel a little bit more, I'm grateful for the opportunity to sort of work these things, because this whole venture is about working through things and
mm-hmm.
trying to get to a better place, because we both agree that we're in a very challenging time. It's a very threatening time on a lot of different levels, actually, and so we're trying to work it through. So there's a reason why we're doing this, and I always find it very helpful, and I have found it very helpful, Michael, to be working through things that I haven't quite figured out yet. It's going to be a little bit messy, but I appreciate having a partner with that. So thank
Absolutely.
you.
So this means the band's not breaking up.
The band's not breaking up. I'm not doing a solo album yet.
There you go. All right. Well, Barry, thank you. And everyone, thank you for listening. Have a great day.
Bye bye.